and welcome now as we begin this time to look at the second Sunday of this Lenten time for this year. And the readings for this time, first reading comes from the book of Genesis, chapter 22, verses 1 and 2, 9a, 10 through 13, and 15 through 18. So it's going to take a story and break it up, leaving out some parts, which we will kind of fill in a little bit today as we look at things. The second reading comes from the letter of Paul to the Romans, chapter 8, verses 31, and verses 6 through 34. And the gospel comes from Mark, this time chapter 9, verses 2 through 10. The gospel today, which is always a gospel chosen for the second Sunday of Lent for many, many years now, is a story which we call the transformation or transfiguration of Jesus. We will look at that a little bit as we go along, but I'm going to begin by looking at the Genesis story, which is in our tradition known as the offering of Abraham of his son Isaac, and in the Hebrew tradition is known as the binding of Isaac. It is a story which is well known by all three of the great Western religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, also look at this story. Abraham, who is, of course, the patriarch, the first of the great patriarchs in the book of Genesis. But the story that we are looking at, the account that we look at today, is one of the most mysterious stories in the whole of the Hebrew Old Testament Bible, and one of the most complicated, commentated on, and difficult to really understand. As we know, Abraham was chosen by God to leave the land of his father, to move from where he was in a mysterious way, to follow where God would lead him, and ultimately he comes to the land of Canaan, which historically will turn out to be the land of Israel. In the course of his relationships with Abraham, God makes a promise to Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation. In fact, on one occasion, and I'm just briefly reviewing the story of Abraham, which leads to the story that we're looking at this time, which is toward the end of the Abraham saga. But God had promised that when he took Abraham outside, it says, look outside and look up into the heavens and see the stars. If you can count the number of stars, that will be the number of prodigies that you will have. Or if you look at the sands on the seashore and count the sands, that will be the number of your progeny. So God promises Abraham that he will be the father of a great nation. But at a certain point, Abraham points out to God that he and his favorite wife, Sarah, he also has a slave wife known as Hagar, that Sarah and he have not produced offspring. Well, what happens as this tradition unfolds is that Sarah gives to Abraham his slave wife Hagar. They have relationships, and a son is born who is called Ishmael. But this is not the child of promise. And there are stories that take place before this. We won't be able to go through them all right now. But Abraham and Sarah do conceive, and the promised child is Isaac. Now, there is a little bit of a tension between Ishmael and Isaac. They are both sons of Abraham, and as the book of Genesis explains, Ishmael becomes the father of many of the nations who are kind of in opposition to Israel, but Isaac becomes the father of the tradition and the family that turns out to be Israel. Now, what is the story that we hear in this reading? It is, to summarize, perhaps you're familiar with this, that at a certain point, God says to Abraham, I want you to take your son and offer him up to me. Now, this is a kind of frightening story. Why would God ask Abraham to take the child of promise and now sacrifice him to the Lord? So you can see that it's a very puzzling story. Certainly in Judaism, it is much, as I mentioned, discussed and reflected on. And Christian writers, as we will see, kind of get out of too much of a concern with this whole question by employing an interpretation which we know as typology. We'll come to that presently. So how does this story go? So Abraham, and there's a lot of unanswered questions that interpreters and reflectors on this story take. Abraham takes with him 2 servants and his son Isaac, his so-called favorite son. And in fact, the text says his only son. Well, that's not really correct, as I mentioned, because he does have another son, Ishmael, whom he does love. And there's a whole story there of how he has to deal with Hagar, the mother of Ishmael, and that relationship. So he takes with him his son Isaac. Questions that people raise with this story, and I just kind of interject as we go along here. How old was Isaac at this point? Where was Sarah when this event takes place? He is told to go to Mount Moriah, a journey when he takes these 2 servants and his son, and they go to Mount Moriah. Well, now interpreters want to know, where is Mount Moriah? Could it have been Mount Hermon, which is the largest mountain? Or Moriah might well be another name for Zion, which is the place where the city of Jerusalem sits. So is this the place? And there is a tradition which says that the place where Abraham was to offer Isaac was in Jerusalem itself. Question, quite mysteriously, is why is God testing Abraham? He has been very faithful, very loyal throughout the course of stories, the saga remembrances of what he has done. What is the point of this test? Now, as they are going along, and you can see there are a lot of blanks that interpretation fills in, as they are going along to Mount Moriah, which takes them a few days to get there, that when they reach the kind of place of ascent to go up to the mountain, Abraham says to the 2 servants, stay here and wait for us till we return. Well, there's the sense of we. Now, who knows what Abraham is about to do? It doesn't seem that Isaac is aware of what he's going to do. Did Sarah know what he was going to do? What was he going to do? Offer his son in sacrifice. As they are pictured going up the hill, up Mount Moriah, Isaac points out to Abraham that we have the wood for the fire, we have the flame to light the fire, but we do not have the sacrifice. Now, can you imagine the dialogue that either went on or didn't go on between father and son? Father knows what he's going to do, son does not. Well, they reach the plateau or hilltop. They build quickly an altar, put the firewood there. After all, these were offerings that were kind of offered up to God. And interestingly, as they're going up the hill, it is Abraham who carries the knife. Does not even give it to his son to carry. So they reach the mountain top. Again, here it's left to our imagination to figure out how it is. Christians tend to think of Isaac as sort of very young, but the tradition would suggest that Isaac is, well, maybe even of an age where he, after all, knew what his father was about to do, allowed himself, as I mentioned, the Hebrew tradition calls this the binding of Isaac, put on the altar, and in what turns out to be certainly a very dramatic gesture, as Abraham lifts the knife to plunge it into his son. Can you imagine this? A father killing his son, his firstborn son, the son of the promise, the one he has waited for all these years, all those numbers of the stars and the sands of the sea going out of existence as the knife descends into his son. Of course, as we know, at the last minute, a voice from heaven says, "Stop, don't do this, for I've seen what you are willing to do." Abraham looks over in some thickets and sees a ram caught there, takes the ram, places it on the altar, sacrifices it to God. But isn't this a strange story? Why would God ask such a thing? Why would God test Abraham? And how does Abraham, by the way, respond to this request of God that he offer up Isaac? Silence. We do not know what Abraham is thinking. The text never explains what he might have been thought. Was he angry? Was he serene? Was he trusting? Was he despairing? Was perhaps even planning an escape? It's a very disturbing story in a certain way if you think about it. And we have no insight into the interior thinking of Abraham or Isaac or Sarah, only the exterior actions. After this, Isaac never speaks again. We will meet some stories of him later on, but in this context, we have no idea what the relationship between his father and perhaps his mother was, if she knew this. Why this test? Why does God require or ask this sacrifice? Now, explanations have been offered as to why this might happen, or why this happened. Some say, and of course this is a nice way to kind of get out of it, is that Abraham misunderstood things. He had grown up in a culture in which other tribes and groups would offer up a sacrifice to their gods of the firstborn. Therefore, Abraham, looking around at the other tribes and peoples that he lived with, thought that this would be a necessary thing, not appropriate, but certainly necessary thing to do, and so therefore he had misinterpreted. And at the last moment, as the knife is ready to plunge, God corrects Abraham by saying, "That's not what I'm looking at." And it may later on be explain the fact why Israel never engaged in human sacrifice. When you think about it, human sacrifice was known to exist in the ancient world, and often it would be children that would be offered up. That tradition even spreads to other parts of the history of humankind. So is that the reason why Abraham did what he did? Well, that's a nice way to get off of the answer the question, to get off the issue, but most agree that's a nice try there. Now, why do we use this text even? Why does it appear? This is the only time that this particular story, this second Sunday of the Lenten and the cycle that we're in, appears. But it also appears at the Easter Vigil as one of the chosen readings, the second reading that can be used at the Easter Vigil. So there is a reason why we do this. I mentioned at the beginning that Christians give this what we call a typological explanation. And we're indebted here to Augustine, famous St. Augustine, who said here that the type, see, typological means a type, that Isaac is a type of Jesus. And just as Isaac carried the wood for the sacrifice up the mountain to be sacrificed, Jesus carries the wood of the cross up to Calvary. The only difference here is Isaac does not get sacrificed. Jesus, on the other hand, on the cross is sacrificed or dies on the cross, which also would be a reason why perhaps this particular episode is chosen for this particular week. Well, that's an explanation. But as you can see, it leaves a lot of unanswered questions. Basically, of course, what kind of a God would this be who would be pleased with this? Because in other places, God will say to the prophets like Isaiah and Jeremiah, I'm not interested in these kind of sacrifices. So why? And we don't have an answer. That is why I say this is one of the more disturbing stories in the Hebrew Bible. As I say, Christians somewhat give an answer in terms of the typology or typological explanation, but even that leaves something to reflect on. Is God testing? And this, of course, is a question that we struggle with. Does God test us? Why would God test us? And that doesn't seem to be what God is also interested in doing. So what is, of course, admired, why this story is connected with Abraham rather than with Isaac. Notice what I'm saying here. In the Jewish tradition, it's Isaac gets the emphasis. In the Christian tradition, it's Abraham. And why is he honored? For his obedience. God asks him to do something, and he does it. Unquestionably, we don't know what he's thinking, he never says anything. He just does what God wants. And it's that idea that Paul, in one of his letters, praises Abraham for his obedience. Well, all right, that's fine. So Abraham is obedient to what God wants. But why would God want that? So if you kind of reflect on this, I spent a little bit of time on this because it is certainly a very powerful story and very disturbing to, if you just take it out of context. The context here seems to be God remains faithful. Remember I said that these first readings are about covenants. God had made a covenant, as I mentioned, with Abraham. You will be the father of a great nation. This agreement, there's other sections in the Genesis account where this covenant between God and Abraham is established. But here, the promise of God still remains. I will make you the father of a great people. Moving to the gospel is, as I mentioned at the beginning, in the 9th chapter of Mark. This is an episode that is also recorded in Matthew and Luke, which is known as the transfiguration or the transformation. Now, there is some historical evidence about this. There is what we call different interpretations, by the way, as to where this story, you remember what happens is Jesus chooses 3, and in Mark, it's always the same favorite 3, Peter, James, and John. Just exactly why. And in another way, a characteristic of the Markan story is the use of 3. Well, it's found in other places too. After you think about it, good stories often have three. Think how often, holy, 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 different times in which we use that repetition. Now, they go up, the three or four of them, up on a high mountain. Well, now the question that we raise is, what mountain is this? Could it be Mount Hermon, as I mentioned, which is the highest mountain just at the top, the north of Israel? It would take a while to really get up there. In fact, it is the one place in Israel, even today, that there is some evidence of snow. You can, in most of the months of the year, look up to the very top and see snow. And as an aside, the Israelis are turning it into a little ski business in recent times. But it probably was not that mountain they climbed. Could have been Mount Carmel or Carmel, which would be toward the Mediterranean. But the more traditionally accepted one is Mount Tabor, Tabor, which since the 4th century has been the place where it is believed that the transfiguration took place. And even today, if you visit Israel, to get up to Mount Tabor, you take a very winding and kind of scary automobile ride up to the top. Again, just an aside. It is on the top of the mountain that the three see Jesus now in a new light. He is literally transformed or transfigured. His clothes become whiter than bleach. So I don't know how white that is, but it's pretty white. And they discover, the three of them, you can imagine, blinded and illuminated by this appearance of Jesus. Peter says, well, I think it would be good, he doesn't know what to say, it says, but then he says something. Maybe we could build 3 tents here, one for you, one for Elijah, and one for Moses. So also appearing with Jesus are Elijah and Moses. Of course, putting together a kind of biblical image here, Moses represents the lawgiver, and Elijah represents the prophet. So they are pictured as conversing with Jesus, but in this gospel we have no indication of what they are talking about. At a certain point, having Peter saying, let's build 3 tents here, or it might be reference to an experience that is part of the Jewish community and would have been at the time that this Jesus lived, known as the Feast of Booths. And the Feast of Booths, which is celebrated in Israel after the autumn harvest, families used to live outside in tents, representing the years that they were in the wilderness. So that's where the idea of tent or the word tabernacle is used. And even today, the Hebrew community observes this, many of them, by decorating perhaps a room in their house to look kind of like the outside. So is that what Peter wants to do? We'll build tents here, so what? A sense of permanence. He doesn't know what to say. Then the voice says, "This is my beloved Son, hear him." Now, interpreters of Mark's story point out that there are 3 scenes in which Jesus is pointed out as God's Son. The first one had been when he was baptized. Remember, coming out of the waters, mentioned that a few times in the past. This is my beloved Son. And the last time that, remember I said 3 times, the third time is after Jesus dies on the cross. The centurion who is standing and watching what is happening says, "Truly this was the Son of God." Now, this story of the Transfiguration sets right in the middle almost of Mark's story. And again, the same words, identifying Jesus as God's Son. So there is that triad pattern again, that kind of 3. At the beginning, at the end, and then in the middle, to illustrate and to illuminate the point that Mark is making, that Jesus is truly God's man, God's Son. So there are a lot of characteristics here that are certainly familiar to those connected with the Bible. For example, Moses had on Mount Sinai experienced God. Moses had climbed, you can check all of this out in the book of Exodus, had climbed a high mountain, had been in the presence of a special group, had a radiance of a central figure, had the fear of onlookers, there was a cloud, and there was a voice. So the experience of Moses also, by the way, is something that was experienced by Elijah. So there are some connections there. Why is this story offered to us on the second Sunday of Lent? Because what had immediately preceded this was a prediction on the part of Jesus that they were going up to Jerusalem, where he would be handed over, where he would be tried, crucified, and on the third day rise again. So many see this story as kind of, amid the sorrow and suffering, the promise that something wonderful will happen. That leads some to say that this story doesn't belong here, that it is really a resurrection story, and that somewhere along the line, a story which was known was put here for the benefit that I just mentioned. Another interpretation was that this is part of what is called an apocalyptic story, namely a wonderful new age and time will come. And here now Jesus is pictured in a wonderful new light and in a new way. So this particular episode in the gospel synoptic tradition is interpreted in different ways, but the one that probably is most important is the one that we've been looking at so far. So as they are coming down from the mountain now, suddenly, by the way, just to finish that up, you remember that the idea of tents doesn't work out. Suddenly they hear the voice, and when they look up after the voice, there is Jesus alone, looking again ordinary. The transfiguration is over. As they are coming down from the mountain, once again a phrase that is common in Mark's story, Jesus says, "Now don't tell anybody about this until the Son of Man has risen from the dead." Well, and they are pictured as saying, what does that mean? What does it mean to be risen from the dead? Now, of course, you know this, I know this, because we know the end of the story. But if you keep the players in the story, and here the big three, often just are slow in understanding what's happening. But here one can see the whole kind of paschal mystery, if you want. Jesus talks about suffering and death, but now the glory that will come after that is completed. So it is with this in mind that we are offered these readings this week. Still, going back to the opening story in Genesis, is this very challenging story of Abraham, the loyalty of Abraham, the fidelity of Abraham, but it also raises, and maybe it's something we reflect on, that God does not test. And that's important, I think, for us to reflect. We do a lot of testing of others, but God doesn't test us. Or is it? And of course, here is the question, do we test God? Do we say, let's see whether God will respond to what we want? Could that have been a reason why Abraham took his son Isaac, to see if God would really respond to him? So you see, this whole section can be interpreted and is reflected on in many different ways. If you want, you can go online and find a number of ways in which the story, the offering of Abraham, the binding of Isaac, and the story is also told in the Quran, in the Islamic tradition. So it is one that universally joins the three great Western religions together. Well, thank you very much for being with us, and hope to see you again.